just going to talk a little bit about Aaron. And I've kind of written something briefly, which to my own amusement was called A Movable Feast of Language, notes on Aaron Shurin. And there's so many things I'd like to say about Aaron, but to try to keep it short and brief, I'll start by way of intro by a few selected facts. One, that he was the first graduate of the legendary New College Poetics program under his friend and mentor Robert Duncan, Diana Prima, Mark McNaughton, and a host of others. He's written over a dozen books of poetry and prose. He was an early activist for the gay rights movements from the East and West Coast. And he helped start the Good Gay Poets, which is one of my favorite underground presses. That published his book, The Night's Sun, in 1976, I believe, and a year before that, in my mind, the infamous kind of John Wiener's collection, Cincinnati Pike or Behind the State Capitol. And the list obviously goes on. So for starters, what I find intriguing in Aaron's work is that there's an intense revelation of language, which is an absorption with the primal acts of it, acts that stem from the imaginations, or his imagination's infinitely complex quest to discover and display its findings. And by that, I mean, I just really dig that he's able to capture feelings before words can really describe them. And the words chosen to do such are so ornately strung together that when one hears them aloud, they seem to cross the boundaries of genre. Single poems turn into novelettes. Other poems seem like epic tales, and those that seem autobiographical seem to me like immediate memoirs, like a page torn out of Jean Genet's Professional Secrets, or excuse me, that was Jean Cocteau, or Jean Genet's Our Lady of the Flowers. And at any rate, however, whatever form his work takes, essay or otherwise, to me they always come to me as a poem. Poems with many voices and singular words, and sentences alchemically built to assist these voices in communicating. And by his continued use of what I refer to as prose blocks, he creates windows or revolving doors, an accessibility that allows the reader to leave or enter at any time. And I find that true with all of my favorite poets, and the fact that you can really enter into a book and read something and leave at any time you want. And the poems always feel new, as if there's a, that kind of timeless tone where the furniture's been moved around, or you know the poem, but something's different. And so I can always return to his work, and it's always fresh in that sense. In that sense, I was also thinking of Keats' his Chamber of Maiden Thought letter, where the mind is a mansion of many rooms, and I really view Aaron's poems as kind of a mansion of many ballrooms. But I also think it's increasingly rare to find a lyric poet, especially today, and one, as Robert Duncan said, that has a spirit of romance. And by that I mean one whose poems are maps of many worlds traveled, of multiple immediacies, sexual, psychic, and imagined, poems that are cosmological, that are communal, that don't want to contain meaning but discover it, that are part of a tradition of intrusions, impulses, accidents, all informed by an attention to what the poem wants, not what we as a poet want. And his poems always remain open, and open to me means that you don't begin and you don't end. You're constantly there, entering in. So when Evan asked me to speak this evening, at first Aaron didn't come instantly to mind. I was thinking, well, there's so many poets that I love, but all my peers would expect that out of me or something. And Aaron as well, but I've always been influenced by his life, or his person, as much as his poems. And then I didn't really realize it until I had returned to writing what I call prose blocks like a few months ago, and I was like, oh no shit, because Aaron's been giving me poems for many years, and he's been writing in these prose blocks, and so obviously I'm going to gravitate towards that form. And so now I'm kind of really thinking of these little prose blocks of his, which are really like a half page or a quarter page or something. It's kind of like sonnets on steroids. I mean, really, you can do anything you want to do in them, just like with a sonnet. But they're just, they're kind of justified, and so you can really, to me, you can move around as much as one wants. And, even though we share similar loves, I think it's completely different for what gets laid down on the page. So I'm going to read a poem of his, and then a poem of mine, and then just talk a little bit more about his work, and then read another poem of his and a poem of mine. The practice. They mistook me for illumination, a revenant in walking shoes. So I gathered significance and spread text, stood beneath the 7 cardinal points with arms upraised, practical telepathy, in a white paper suit like a flag of surrender, thunder at my back. I was an open man of the open streets, a burnished sieve of common purpose, scrawled on walls, thrashed cans, and blasted caps for equivalents. I wasn't alone. The boulevards teemed with wiggly kids and mooing parents, slow as boulders. In the Plaza Palabra, on a green iron bench, a grand sonora suffered the odes of schoolboys and thugs, smiled behind an open fan while they searched for words to match their tumultuous nights. And all words fit. In July, volubility. I hoarded cherries, cataloged their juices. Were they Rainier, Bloodnut, Royal Anne, Squirrel Heart, Rosebud, or Bing? Then swallowed them one by one, like denotations, initiations. In a fervor of taxonomy, I followed a squadron of dragonflies right to the vanishing point. Incarnation is a provisional state, but stretches outward like noon. For practice, I wallowed and stretched. Fresh-cut remnants. Telepathically, I'm uneasy. I no longer know what city we're in, and the absence hurts. Either meaning has died away, or I lack the strength of solitude to think things through. Defeat continues to surround, and its words slash with an enclave of ordinary talk. At the moment, trillions is the operative, and everyone is stumbling towards execution. Apart from that, the hits keep coming, and I'm tasting all the joys I deserve. Don't worry, I still vow to create an atmosphere of glamour. Give me a closet, and I'll turn it into a palace or gallery overnight. Since when hasn't a single room been enough to disarm? Enough reflection, too much stimulation has made living easy to ignore. When I'm not filling the void of an exile poet, natural things are harder to achieve. This involuntary iambic shows how difficult I've become. Welcome to the downfall, and feel free to show yourself around. All this, yet I'm still able to pass incognito and surge the murmurs. Nothing too theatrical, just a little drama to disarm the voices. Gone are the days where an exchange of glances said it all. Communication has fallen to a clumsy high, and I refuse to participate in its stagnating leisure. I deserve your reproaches, but I also deserve indulgence. It wasn't always a desert, but it was always a vast expanse. So I believe my latest attraction to his works really stems from my continued interest in the French, particularly Baudelaire, Apollinaire, Flaubert, all the bears, Michaud, Reverdy, Colette, and besides his longtime peers, which is a host of many, many people, given his lineage from living here many years and being active in various communities and micro-communities, from Robert Gluck to Diana Prima to Norma Cole to Michael Palmer. I also find them very useful to my own writing, but it's really the textured, esoteric, and narcotically romantic line of the French that he shares, that I think I share with him, that really remains primary to my own sensibilities. And speaking about prose blocks, I think of them, I know we've all seen like books of translations where the English translation is forced into just really like a prose block on the bottom of the page. So it's not native to its own line breaks or its own narrative or its own language, it's just with this block. And I really dig the French versions of those, because especially like Apollinaire, like if you read Zone, when it's down like that, you get a fully different feeling. And I say that out of a sense of naivete, in the sense that I don't know the language enough to actually read it, but to have the translation in a prose block really works for me. So over the years, so I think it's kind of nice to think of those as sonnets, and then just try to think of the poem as that. Try to have this form. And I feel a little reluctant to impose any type of form on any type of language or content. But at the moment, it works for me. So whatever. So I'm going to rewind a little bit. So my first intro into Aaron really occurred when I became a student at New College of California, and I checked out his thesis, projector verse on Walt Whitman, and really devoured it at Muddy Waters on 16th. I was in the back, kind of sketchy, you know, as it used to be. And then it gave me my own idea for my MA thesis there. I just stole it. Negative capability in the verse of John Wiener's, let it be known now. But besides that, I think there was another book that I came onto called Narrativity, which was a small book that Sun and Moon printed in 1990. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, was a talk he did at the Painted Bride in Philly, circa like 1989 or something. And so it was turned into a beautiful small book, kind of like remember those hypercolor shirts with sweat? Anyway, it was kind of one of those covers that kind of reflected light or something. Anyway, non sequiturs. But I got into that when I first got here. I mean, I hadn't really started reading poetry. I mean, I was in high school when that came out, so I came out here in the late 90s and got turned on to that. And it really kind of opened up things for me. So I'm going to read from the opening paragraph briefly. And Aaron says, I'm interested in the utilization of both poetic and narrative tensions, the flagrant services of lyric, the sweet dream of storied events, the terror of ellipses, the audacity of dislocation, the irreversible solidity of the past tense, the incarnate lure of pronouns, the refractability of pronouns, the simultaneity of times, the weights and balances of sentences. I'm interested in lyric's authenticity of demonstration and narrative's drama of integration. Lyric, whose operation is display, and narrative, whose method is seduction. And so that was, I guess, I'm terrible with numbers, I think that was like 25 years ago. And so before then, he had a book called The Graces, and I believe that came out in 1982, and he was already fusing narrative components of person and place, and really intriguing them into dense units of sound and measure, so that where the persuasion of language could allow one to levitate really between personal and imagined experience. And the subject speaking could be anything or anyone would want. And I've always wanted to do that in my own poems, in the sense that who cares what the gender is when you're reading a poem? I want it to be universal. So it really goes into that Rimbaud, like I as another, or Whitman, I can contain multitudes, or whatever. Did we get that right? Did you write that down? It doesn't matter. I mentally think of like Morrissey's I'm asexual, but it has nothing to do with anything. But those are the obvious forerunners for me. And so what I've come to expect in Aaron's work is a really long, Whitman-esque cataloging line that picks up everything in its way as it moves forward. And usually, I'll be honest, like when I read his work, right when I feel like I'm too high to deal with it, from him and my own means, from its density and sensory overload, he gives me like breathing room by an M dash and ellipses. And whenever I see these, I feel like the poem could be done, but then I realize he's really giving himself a line break and me a line break, or I think of these ellipses and M dashes as little feigning rooms, so that I can naturally pick up where I left off, And I also find that when his work, and just through my own practice of like kind of collage composition, not to be cliche about that or whatever, it's like saying the word poetics these days, he's able to take completely different voices and different lines and really meld them into one, so that the result is a maximalized line that stands on its own, almost as if each line could be a single poem or a single broadside. And I realize that the lines in poems are obviously parts that make up a whole. But his lines, they create, when they come together, they create a sort of multiple exposure, or a set of correspondences that inform us as they form. And so when I was reading his work recently, I was thinking of that kind of alchemical embroidery and how things fit together. And so I started, and while I was reading it, I was listening to Guided by Voices a lot, and it was really like the cut and paste songs of Guided by Voices from the albums like B1000 and Alien Lanes, and who cares if you're not familiar with them, the title's great. Under the Bushes, Under the Stars, it's just like everything is kind of melding together. But also I was thinking of it as like this kind of endless seducing and conjuring layers and this panoramic feeling of like the films of Kenneth Anger, certain films of him, the more occult ones, and with Stan Brakhage as well. And also the M dashes and the ellipses are also kind of remind me of like, Orpheus and Cocteau's, or Orpheus and Cocteau's Orpheus, like really tuning in into the underworld. So it's like there's little frequencies in between the poems. At any rate, I'm almost done. So the last point I'd like to make is that his poems, to me, are really hallucinogenic by nature, with their intense visual and auditory modalities, and their ever-morphing emotional arcs and registers. And there's really a saturation of visceral experience that's articulated through a alluring high diction that one feels like she's not only seduced by the poem, but she's its roving star and soundtrack. So I'm going to read a poem by his and a poem by me, and I'll be done. Reconstructed. This was important. I had to make the walls sing. I had to tip in the books and tilt them towards memory or suspense. It was crucial. The naked shelves cried as though the new wood were splitting. I had to place the masks so that the eyes burned. Who else would stand on guard? And fit the paintings to the frames to the walls, so a conversation flowed in all directions as the breeze blows in a storm. I was a storm, to make a matrix of surrounding talk as if the room were blowing bubbles of an alphabet. It was vital. I had to bed Lucas, Tony, Mark, and what's-his-name. Well, what's-his-name was standing up to lubricate the monotheistic air and put blowholes in the ceiling. I laid down carpets to animalize the floor, skin and fur, to raise a menagerie of objects in a community of twitching things by which I countered the ever-barking dogs, rolled on my back in the fur of the floor, and panted. This was essential. I had to learn to walk again, study again, cook again, clean again, cut my hair again, roll a J again, back my files up again, not trip on the ball gown again, hike up my pants, make the bed, shave my neck again, to assemble the parts of the day like twigs and spittle for a nest. Do you know birds, those flying texts? I watched them through my window and watched the moon too, and read the phrases of their swoops and orbit arcs as a book of spells to make the walls sing. The walls sang and the mask flamed and the paintings talked and the boys came and the rugs twitched and the spells were set and other spells were broken and the nest wove itself into a cupped hand, a bed. I lay down. It was foundation. So this poem was from a new unpublished collection of his, and that, not to get too OCD, but it had 6 M dashes and 7 ellipses, and the other one had 13 M dashes and 7 ellipses. And I'm saying that in the sense that if we broke the line each time that it's there, you really could scatter it out like a projective breath across the page. But it's amazing to me that he's able to have the same effect, but in a closed form. So that's really the alluring part to me, that you can actually, you're not really dictated by this form. You can do everything else but there, in your own containment. So I'll end a piece with my own, which comes off of Aaron, but it's got I think it's got James Schuyler in the blender. I've just been reading a lot of his art reviews, and those two are like little prose blocks. Even though it's criticism, it's like half a page or something. And it's probably from Word Limit, from Art News or something. I'll read a new one. This has more of I've been reading Colette's letters and Aaron's poems together, and Flaubert's journals to Egypt. So let's read this and finish it up. Let's call it On the Baltic. Expecting to relax is a hoax. I've been showing the guests our new necropolis, and even its charms are no match for humidity. The ligustrums are in full bloom, and breathing makes me exhausted. That a tree holds so much power over one's disposition. You're 100 times right. I'm too busy and can't write, which makes me nervous and disagreeable. Thank you infinitely for the magic chocolate, which was a great success. Yet let me reveal the comic side. I'm finally sociable, but the effects didn't wear off for days. The profile of a face still says more than its tongue, and bright light carries an anxiety provoked by noise. I admire those with a mercurial frequency, but I'm entirely too attentive to live out my weakness in silence. So why is everyone sleepwalking to the next reading anyway? Their vast despondency doesn't make it easier to insult or attract at will, and around the obvious types, it's harder to keep the jokes at bay. Give them what they think they want, seems the motto. Maybe I'm too close, or your last batch was much stronger. Right when I abandoned intelligence, a metaphysical clarity possessed me that terrified everyone, including myself. Nothing new, just managing miracles out of chaos. I always thought it was easier to let the sentences crash into conversation rather than retreat like tides. It's not what gets said, but how we say it. Did I mention I miss my duties as a night watchman? There seems to be a grudge about what shore one travels from, and the result doesn't correspond with the effort. Who knows the details, but whatever carnal tenacity existed has now become quite the tyranny. All this, and we share the same sky at 3 a.m. If anyone asks, tell them I get up at dawn and oversee interior decoration. I can't play the child card much longer. I've also been pawning things for immediate liberty. Looks like we'll be paid rather handsomely for the letters, which will be sold as a deluxe volume. Think of it as my annual virtue debauch, almost clandestine. Thanks.